Clearwater International Airport was as busy as usual on a crisp autumn morning. The terminal was buzzing with activity. Travelers hurriedly walking to and from gates, the sound of rolling luggage wheels echoing off the tile floors, and the occasional voice announcing flight delays or boarding calls. For Lance Thompson, a former Marine turned airport security officer, it was just another day. Beside him was his trusty partner, Apollo, a large German shepherd with a nose like no other. Apollo's sharp senses and dedication had earned him a reputation, and he was always ready for whatever challenges the day might throw their way. Lance had grown used to the humdrum of airport security. He had walked the same halls for years, checking bags, scanning through the crowd and making sure everything was running smoothly. There was a sense of comfort in routine, but today felt different. Something was off, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it. It was early in the morning, just before the rush of the day began. Lance and Apollo were assigned to patrol the baggage claim area, where passengers were waiting for their luggage after a long flight. The area was relatively quiet, the faint sound of footsteps and the hum of luggage belts the only noise. Lance scanned the room, observing the passengers as they went about their business. Everything appeared normal, just the usual sights and sounds. As they moved toward an isolated corner by an abandoned carousel, Apollo suddenly stiffened. Lance glanced down at his partner, noting the change in his behavior. Apollo's ears were perked up, his nose twitching as if trying to catch a scent. Lance paused, feeling a sense of unease creeping in. "What's wrong, boy?" Lance muttered softly, unsure of what had caused Apollo's sudden alertness. Without warning, Apollo broke the silence with a sharp bark, his focus entirely on something in front of him. Lance followed his gaze and saw an old, worn-out suitcase sitting alone by the carousel. It looked out of place, as though it had been forgotten or abandoned. It wasn't uncommon to see misplaced bags in an airport, but something about this one felt different. Apollo's barking grew louder, more insistent, and that's when Lance knew something wasn't right. "Easy, boy," Lance said, trying to calm the dog down. But Apollo wasn't listening. He was fixated on the suitcase, growling now, his eyes wide with intensity. Lance's heart rate quickened. This was no ordinary situation. He could tell Apollo was picking up on something. But what could it be? Lance knew better than to ignore his dog's instincts. He immediately radioed for backup, signaling for his colleagues to come to the baggage claim area. His voice was steady, but there was an edge of urgency to it now. "I need help over here," he said. "We've got a situation." As he waited for his team to arrive, he kept a careful eye on the suitcase. He didn't want to escalate things if there was no real threat, but Apollo's behavior was telling him otherwise. More officers quickly arrived on the scene, forming a cautious perimeter around the suitcase. Lance's supervisor, Officer Jensen, arrived shortly after, taking in the situation with a glance. "What's going on, Thompson?" Jensen asked, his voice calm but alert. Lance nodded toward Apollo, who was still barking, his stance tense and defensive. "Apollo's not backing down. Something's off about this suitcase," Lance explained, his hand resting on Apollo's collar, trying to keep him calm. "It's not like the usual lost luggage. I think we should open it up." Jensen considered this for a moment, then nodded in agreement. "All right, let's do this carefully. We don't know what we're dealing with." The officers formed a protective circle around the suitcase as they prepared to investigate. The tension in the air was palpable as Lance stepped back, keeping Apollo close by his side. The officers moved slowly, cautiously, taking their time to assess the situation. Lance couldn't shake the feeling that something important was about to happen. Why had Apollo reacted so strongly? Why had that suitcase been left there untouched for so long? His mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. The zipper on the suitcase was old, the teeth rusted and worn, but it still functioned. Lance watched closely as one of the officers grabbed hold of the zipper and slowly began to pull it open. The sound of the zipper sliding against the fabric seemed louder than usual, the silence in the room pressing in on him. As the suitcase opened, the room seemed to hold its breath. Lance stood frozen, his eyes fixed on the suitcase. What would they find inside? Something told him that this wasn't just another routine security check. Something was about to change. The zipper was finally pulled all the way open, and the officers gasped in unison. Lance's heart skipped a beat as he looked inside. Curled up in the suitcase, shivering and terrified, was a little girl, no older than 4. Her face was pale, her hair tangled, and her eyes were wide with fear. She was clutching a worn teddy bear, holding it like her life depended on it. For a moment, nobody moved. The discovery hit Lance like a punch to the gut. His mind raced. Who would abandon a child like this? What had happened to her? He felt a deep, overwhelming urge to protect her, even though he knew nothing about her. As the paramedics rushed in to assess the girl's condition, Lance remained rooted to the spot, his eyes never leaving the suitcase. Everything around him seemed to fade into the background. The crowd of officers, the sounds of the airport, it all seemed distant now. All that mattered was the tiny, vulnerable life in front of him. The girl was alive, but barely. It was clear that she had been through something traumatic, but she was still clinging to her teddy bear, a symbol of comfort in a world that had failed her. As the paramedics gently lifted her out of the suitcase, Lance felt a strange mixture of relief and sorrow. She was safe for now, but the questions remained. Who had done this to her? And why had she been left in such a terrible way? Lance couldn't help but feel a deep sense of responsibility for her, even though he barely knew her. Something about this child, this fragile stranger, had touched a part of him he thought he had left behind long ago. The mystery of the suitcase and the girl inside was only just beginning to unfold. Lance stood frozen, his eyes fixed on the little girl in the suitcase. For a brief moment, the noise of the bustling airport seemed to fade into silence, leaving only the quiet sobs of the child in the foreground. Her body was frail, her cheeks hollow, and her tiny hands gripped a worn teddy bear like it was the only thing keeping her tethered to the world. Lance's heart ached, the emotions stirring within him stronger than he could have anticipated. He had seen his share of tragedies as a former Marine, but nothing had ever struck him like this. The girl's condition, the fear in her eyes, it was as if she had been discarded, thrown away without a second thought. The paramedics moved swiftly, taking charge of the situation. One of them, a woman with a calm demeanor, crouched next to the girl and gently cradled her in her arms. She was still shivering, her small body trembling as if it hadn't fully processed that it was safe yet. "She's alive," the paramedic said, her voice soft but steady. "But she's in shock. We need to get her to the medical center immediately." Lance nodded, feeling a surge of protectiveness flood through him. He had to know more, had to do everything in his power to help this child. But as the paramedics whisked her away, Lance stayed behind, still in a daze. The suitcase, now empty, sat on the floor, a haunting reminder of the mystery that had just unfolded. What had happened to this little girl? Who had left her there, abandoned like discarded luggage? His mind raced, but no answers came. He was used to solving problems in the military, to following orders and reacting quickly, but this situation was different. There were no orders to follow here, no immediate action to take. It was just him, and the memory of that terrified little girl, stuck in a suitcase in the middle of an airport. Soon, Officer Jensen, his supervisor, approached him. Lance barely noticed him at first, his focus still on the empty suitcase. "Thompson?" Jensen's voice cut through the fog in Lance's mind. "Let's get to the medical unit. You need to stay close to her. You're the only one she's shown any trust in." Lance didn't hesitate. Without saying a word, he followed Jensen, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. As they walked down the sterile hallways of the airport medical center, he couldn't help but think about his own daughter, Emily. She had been taken from him years ago, the pain of losing her still fresh in his heart. Emily had been full of life, just like this little girl. The similarities struck Lance like a blow to the chest. This child had no one. She had no family, no one to take care of her. And yet, Lance felt a fierce protectiveness over her, as though he were meant to be the one to help her. They arrived at the medical unit where the girl was being carefully placed on a bed. She was still clutching her teddy bear, her eyes wide, darting around the room as if she were trying to make sense of her new surroundings. Lance stood by the door, not wanting to intrude on the doctors, but he couldn't tear his gaze away from her. There was something about her that made him feel responsible for her, something about her vulnerability that stirred a deep, fatherly instinct in him. "We're going to take good care of you, sweetheart," a nurse said gently, her voice soothing as she wrapped a warm blanket around the girl's shivering form. But the little girl didn't respond. She just lay there, her body tense, her eyes still wide with fear. Lance felt a pang in his chest as he watched her. She had been through something terrible. That much was clear. But what? Who had hurt her? The next few hours were a blur. Lance stayed at the medical unit waiting for any updates, but nothing concrete came. The authorities were already conducting an investigation, but the girl had no identification. No personal belongings other than the teddy bear she held onto so tightly. No one knew who she was or where she came from, and no one came forward to claim her. It was as though she had appeared out of nowhere. The following morning, Lance was back on duty, but his thoughts kept returning to the girl, Lily, as the medical staff had started calling her. The name seemed to suit her, though he still didn't know if it was the right one. He couldn't shake the feeling that her story wasn't over. Something told him that there was more to this little girl than anyone realized, and he had to be the one to find out what that was. His supervisor, Jensen, had asked him to stay close to Lily, to be her anchor while she adjusted to the overwhelming changes in her life. Lance agreed without question. She needed someone she could trust, someone who wouldn't judge her, someone who would help her find her way back from whatever darkness she had come from. As the days passed, Lance found himself spending more and more time with Lily. He would visit her at the medical center, sitting by her bedside, just being there for her. She rarely spoke, but Lance didn't mind. He understood that she had been through too much to be expected to open up right away. Instead, he let her guide their interactions. Sometimes she would reach out and touch his hand, and Lance would smile gently, giving her the space she needed to feel safe. It was small progress, but it was progress nonetheless. One evening, as Lance sat beside her, he noticed her eyes flutter, open. She looked at him, her gaze still filled with uncertainty, but there was something different about it now, a flicker of recognition, maybe even a hint of trust. And for the first time since this all began, Lance allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could be the one to give this little girl a second chance at life. The investigation continued, but the leads remained frustratingly scarce. It was clear that Lily had been abandoned, but the details were still a mystery. Where had she come from? Who had left her at the airport? And why? Lance didn't have the answers, but he wasn't about to give up on her. He knew that her story wasn't over. It was just beginning, and he was determined to be there for every step of the journey. As he left the medical center that evening, he glanced back at the door where Lily had been. He wasn't sure what the future held, but one thing was certain: he wasn't going anywhere. Whatever darkness had surrounded Lily's life, he would face it head-on, because now, she was part of his world. It had been a week since Lance had taken on the responsibility of looking after Lily, the little girl found curled up in the suitcase at the airport. The case had hit the news, and soon enough, the entire city was buzzing with the mystery of the abandoned child. Law enforcement was doing everything they could to find her family, but with no reports of missing children matching Lily's description, it seemed as though she had just appeared out of nowhere. For Lance, the past week had been a whirlwind. He had never expected his life to change so dramatically in a matter of days, but here he was, trying to care for a child who barely spoke, who had been through God knows what, and whose history was a complete blank. The girl had clung to her, teddy bear, every moment she was awake, her small fingers never letting go. It was as if the bear was the only piece of her past that she could trust, the only thing familiar in a world that had become a nightmare. Lance's apartment had transformed into a temporary home for Lily. He had cleared out the guest room, set up a small bed, and even arranged a few toys he had gathered. At first, Lily was hesitant, quiet, and withdrawn. She spent most of her time sitting in the corner, staring out the window or clutching her Teddy bear. Lance didn't push her to speak. Instead, he allowed her the space she needed, letting her get used to her new environment at her own pace. Mornings were slow but hopeful. Lance would make breakfast, nothing fancy, just scrambled eggs and toast, and Lily would sit at the table barely eating. She would stare at the food, then glance at him, but say nothing. Lance didn't mind. He just smiled, hoping that eventually she would come to trust him enough to open up. One morning, as Lance set the table, he noticed Lily looking out the window. Her eyes were focused on something in the distance. Maybe she's noticing the world again, he thought to himself. He knew. It was a small sign, but it was progress. He decided to take it slow. "You like watching the cars go by, huh?" he asked gently, trying to keep the conversation light. Lily turned to look at him, her gaze soft but unsure. She nodded, just a little, as if acknowledging his words. As the days passed, Lance's heart began to feel a strange mixture of hope and sadness. He had always thought of himself as someone who could handle anything, whether it was serving in the military or dealing with the endless frustrations of security work at the airport. But this was different. Lily had been through something unimaginable, and Lance felt the weight of her pain every time he looked at her. He could see the fear in her eyes, the shadows of a life she had left behind, and the uncertainty of her future. Yet despite everything, she was slowly starting to trust him. It wasn't easy. Lily rarely spoke, her words coming out in short, quiet sentences when she did. Sometimes, in the dead of night, when she woke from nightmares, Lance would sit beside her bed, holding her hand, offering comfort. It was during one of these nights that she finally spoke to him about her past, and, for the first time, Lance felt like he was getting closer to understanding what had happened to her. She had been sitting up in bed, hugging her teddy bear as usual. Her eyes were wide and there was a distant look in her gaze. Lance sat beside her, rubbing her back gently. "Hey Lily, you okay?" he asked softly. She didn't answer immediately, but after a long pause she whispered, "I had a house. A big house and with a lot of people." Her voice was quiet, almost as if she were afraid to speak any louder. Lance leaned in a little closer. "A big house? What do you remember about it?" he asked, trying to keep his tone calm and comforting. Lily hesitated, her small fingers tightening around the teddy bear. "There was a lady," she said, her voice barely audible. "She didn't like me to talk." Lance's heart tightened. The vague details were not much, but it was a start. Who was this lady? Lance wondered. Why didn't she want Lily to talk? Lance didn't press her further that night. He could tell that it was difficult for Lily to share even these small fragments of her past. Instead, he just nodded and assured her that she was safe. "It's okay, Lily. You don't have to talk if you don't want to," he said gently. But in his mind, a storm of questions swirled. Who was this woman? And why had Lily been kept so isolated in such a large house? These were questions that Lance knew he would have to answer, no matter how long it took. The next few days were filled with more quiet moments. Lance continued to care for Lily, keeping things simple and stable. He took her to the park once, just for a short walk. At first she had been hesitant, but eventually she began to enjoy the fresh air. She pointed out a bird perched on a nearby tree, her eyes lighting up with curiosity. "Look, bird," she whispered. And Lance smiled, feeling a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, Lily was starting to heal. Despite his best efforts, Lance couldn't ignore the questions that plagued his mind. Where was Lily's family? What had happened to her before she arrived at the airport? There were too many gaps, too many unknowns. The authorities were doing their part, investigating every lead they could find, but without solid information, they were running out of options. Then, one evening, Lance received a call from Detective Miller, a friend of his from the force. "Thompson, you might want to sit down for this," Miller said, his voice serious. "We found something. It's not much, but it's a lead." Lance's heart skipped a beat. He listened intently as Miller explained that there were rumors about a secluded mansion on the outskirts of town. It had been linked to child neglect cases in the past, and some of the descriptions matched what Lily had mentioned. Could this mansion be connected to Lily's past? Lance wondered. The next day, Lance drove to the mansion. The house loomed large, hidden behind high walls and security cameras. It looked ominous, like something straight out of a horror movie. Lance parked a distance away, watching the mansion from his car. His instincts told him this was important. This was where Lily's past began, and he needed to uncover the truth. But for now, he knew he had to be careful. He couldn't let Lily know what he was doing. Not yet. She had already been through so much, and he didn't want to scare her with the harsh reality of what had happened to her. But he was determined. Lance promised himself that he would find the answers, no matter what it took. For Lily, he would do whatever it took. Lance had spent the past few days piecing together what little information he could gather about Lily's past. The mansion he had seen from a distance haunted him, but he knew he had to be patient. Every day he would come home from his shifts at the airport to find Lily in the guest room, her small frame curled up in a ball, clutching her teddy bear as though it were her only protection against the world. It broke Lance's heart every time he saw her like that. She was so small, so fragile, and so deeply scarred by whatever had happened to her before she arrived at the airport. Over time, he began to notice small signs of progress. One evening, as they were sitting together on the couch watching the rain fall outside the window, Lily pointed at the sky. "Rain," she whispered, her voice still soft, but more confident than it had been in the past. Lance smiled, encouraging her to say more. "Yes, that's rain," he said gently. "You like watching the rain?" Lily nodded, her eyes fixed on the window. "It's pretty," she murmured, a small smile tugging at her lips. It was the first time Lance had seen her smile since she had arrived. It was a small thing, but it meant the world to him. Slowly but surely, Lily was beginning to find her voice again, to connect with the world around her. Despite these small victories, Lance knew that they couldn't stay in limbo forever. Lily's past was still a mystery, and every day that passed made him more anxious. He couldn't ignore the haunting memories she had shared about her life before. Her vague recollections of a big house, a strict woman, and the overwhelming sense of fear that seemed to follow her every step. Lance knew deep down that if he didn't find the answer soon, he might lose Lily forever, just as he had lost his own daughter years ago. One evening, as Lance sat in the living room, reviewing the notes he had taken on the mansion, he received another call from Detective Miller. This time, Miller's voice had a sense of urgency that made Lance's heart race. "Thompson, we found something. A lead," Miller said. "It's not much, but it's enough to go on." Lance's pulse quickened. "What did you find?" he asked, barely able to contain his excitement. Miller explained that after checking local records and speaking to a few people around town, he had learned that the mansion on the outskirts of town had once been owned by a woman named Marissa Wilson. Marissa had been known for her strictness and her desire to keep to herself. The mansion had been isolated from the rest of the town, with no neighbors for miles. Rumors had always circulated about the place, about the way Marissa had kept the children in her care hidden away from the world. Some even said she was cruel, but no one had ever been able to prove it. The most important detail that Miller had uncovered was that Marissa Wilson had vanished a few years ago. No one knew what had happened to her, but her disappearance had been linked to a series of unresolved child neglect cases. One of the children who had lived in the mansion had been taken away from her care, but the others, like Lily, had simply disappeared. Lance's heart sank. Could Lily have been one of those children? Could she have been raised in that mansion under Marissa Wilson's strict, oppressive rules? The possibility seemed too terrible to imagine. He couldn't let it go. He had to know more. The next day, Lance decided to take a bold step. He drove to the mansion himself, determined to find the answers he had been searching for. As he neared the property, the imposing gates and high stone walls came into view. It looked like something out of a Gothic novel, dark, foreboding, and filled with an aura of secrets. Lance parked a distance away, watching the mansion for a few moments. He could feel the weight of the place, the sense of something ominous, lurking within. He had been here before, but this time something felt different. It was as if the mansion itself was calling to him, urging him to uncover its secrets. He couldn't ignore the sense of urgency that burned inside him. If Lily had been a part of this place, then he had to find out what had happened. For her sake and for his own peace of mind, Lance had to know the truth. He spent hours walking around the perimeter of the mansion, trying to find any clues that could lead him to the answers he was desperate for. He knew he couldn't just barge in. It was too risky, too dangerous. Instead, he took note of everything he saw, every detail that might help him understand what had happened to Lily and the other children who had lived there. He took photos of the property, trying to get a sense of the layout, the security measures, and any signs of activity. Just as he was about to leave, something caught his eye. Near the back of the mansion, there was a small door, half hidden by overgrown ivy. It didn't look like the main entrance, and it certainly didn't look like it had been used in years, but something about it felt important, like a secret waiting to be uncovered. Lance hesitated for a moment, then decided to investigate. He moved cautiously toward the door, his heart pounding in his chest. This could be the break he had been waiting for. As he approached the door, Lance heard the sound of footsteps behind him. He turned quickly, his hand instinctively reaching for the flashlight at his belt. But when he saw who it was, his shoulders relaxed. It was Detective Miller, standing at the edge of the driveway, his hands tucked in his pockets. "Thought you could use some backup," Miller said with a smirk, walking over to Lance. "You didn't think you were going to crack this case alone, did you?" Lance gave him a tired smile. "I was hoping for a little help," he said, his voice grateful, but worn. "But I think this might be it. I think this door leads to something we need to see." The two of them approached the door together, their eyes scanning the surroundings. Miller nodded, then carefully tried the handle. The door creaked open slowly, and a dark, musty smell wafted out. It was as though the mansion had been closed, off for years, keeping its secrets locked away. Lance stepped inside first, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. He moved cautiously, knowing that whatever they found here could change everything. As they ventured deeper into the mansion, they came across a series of old rooms filled with dusty furniture, cobwebs, and the unmistakable sense of neglect. But one room in particular caught Lance's attention. It was small, tucked away at the back of the house, and it looked like it had been recently disturbed. Boxes were overturned, papers were scattered across the floor, and there were signs of hasty movement. Lance's breath caught in his throat as he looked around the room. On the floor, under a pile of papers, he found something that stopped him in his tracks, a photograph. It was a picture of a young girl, no older than 5, standing next to a woman who appeared to be Marissa Wilson. The girl's face was familiar to Lance. He recognized her immediately. It was Lily. "This is it," Lance whispered, his voice filled with shock. "This is the key to everything." The truth was finally starting to unravel, and Lance knew that no matter what came next, he would face it head-on. For Lily, he would stop at nothing to uncover the full story. Her past had been a dark mystery, but now it was time to bring it into the light.